I'm sure you've seen at least one terrarium within your lifetime. For me, it seems like they happen to be everywhere. Whether it's grocery shopping in Loblaws, taking a walk through downtown London, or even when scrolling through my TikTok For You page. It's evident that this type of gardening has taken its toll on the public and is surrounding me everywhere I go. It's like I'm in a horror movie and there's a monster named Terry running after me.
Choose your character.
Terrariums. They're everywhere you go.
So what is a terrarium? Well, so far, I'm sure you've gathered that it's something to do with nature. A terrarium is created to bring the outside world in. It's like a mini ecosystem. The biggest goal in terrarium building is to build it as close as it can be to a real ecosystem. In fact, NASA describes terrariums as a forest enclosed in its own little world. This means living habitants, good drainage, water, light, soil, and so much more. If you want to get technical, a terrarium, or terraria, comes from the Latin word terra, meaning land, and the word itself translates to land within a container. Terrariums aren't as boring as you might think they are. They allow you to explore your creativity and give a glimpse into that ecosystem. Whether your terrarium is terrestrial, aquatic, or even my favorite, lunar. Have you ever heard of a lunar terrarium? Well, they could become essential to life in space. A lunar terrarium is described as a container containing plants and everything needed to survive on the moon. You see, these weren't used often until a few years back in 2019 with the Chinese Chang'e 4 spacecraft. Unlike before, this spacecraft was specifically designed for a climate-controlled biosphere. This biosphere contained potatoes, seeds, cotton, rapeseed, fruit fly pupa, and yeast. This terrarium allowed for these plants to germinate, start photosynthesis, and thrive within these uncanny circumstances. Terrariums were born in 1842 by pure accident. A physician and amateur botanist named Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward had a great fascination with these little critters named moths. Dr. Ward always was a passionate naturalist. This led him to grow a variety of plants. Unfortunately for him, his passion took place during the Industrial Revolution, where the growing conditions were terrible. Out of curiosity and despair, he placed cocoons in jars of soil to observe. Then, just like magic, one of the jars began to sprout. A fern spore and grass seedling had germinated. Without thinking much of this insignificant development, he left the case unsupervised and untouched for 4 years before returning. In this time, the grass began to grow, and grow. Just like that, he discovered what may be the solution to his botany dilemmas. While his plants were failing to survive in the polluted conditions of the East, they were able to thrive within closed environments. This was the birth of the Wardian case, now commonly referred to as terrariums. He later wrote a book about this experience, which would lead to the boom of terrarium building in England. So you want to know how to make a terrarium? Well, to start off, there are 3 essential steps. The first step is to gather materials for drainage. Terrariums are meant to be self-sustaining greenhouses. A drainage layer is vital for the health of a terrarium, as it prevents the terrarium from growing harmful plants and prevents it from developing rotten roots. The second step is to gather your substrate. The substrate is the most important part of a terrarium. Good substrate is nutrient-rich, which allows for life to live within your mini ecosystem. This layer is used to provide important nutrients and hydration. It's important to recall that substrate provides the habitat of all living things in your terrarium. Without good substrate, your terrarium will not grow. The third and final essential step to making a terrarium is to gather some greenery. How can you have an ecosystem with no residents? Greenery is important to a terrarium since it adds life to what would otherwise be a dull environment. The tricky thing about terrariums is that you need plants that are able to live in tropical environments, which, with the way I want to approach this project, I don't have much access to here in Canada during November. To prep building my terrarium, these are all the materials I've gathered. A mason jar, this is where everything will be stored. A separation sheet, to separate the drainage layer from the substrate. A Sharpie, my substrate. Some moss, wood decor, and gravel as well, but I forgot to include it. The first thing I did once I gathered all my materials was prep my separation sheet. You do this by using Sharpie to outline the shape of your jar and begin cutting out the shape. This is essential towards terrarium health because it minimizes the chance of root rot and molding. Once I prepped my false bottom, I was ready to start assembling. I started with my drainage layer. This includes gravel and my separation sheet. The false bottom or drainage layer mimics the water cycle that many plants and living organisms rely on for survival. This is followed by the substrate layer. As I mentioned before, the substrate is the most important and difficult layer to master in a terrarium. It's important you get this layer right to create a healthy, reliable ecosystem. Unfortunately for me, I did not get this layer right, which was the beginning of the end for my terrarium. Instead of a nutrient-rich substrate that would allow life to thrive within it, my soil was dead. It was full of debris, leaves, and sticks. Finally, we have the greenery. This includes my decorations such as bark and sticks, as well as my moss. This layer is vital since moss aids in maintaining moisture in the soil below by regulating water in the terrestrial ecosystem. And more importantly, who doesn't want their ecosystem to look pretty? Now, as the weeks went on, my terrarium did not grow as planned. The biggest contributing factor was the excess moisture. I tried various things to end this problem, such as switching from natural daylight to artificial, wiping it down, but ultimately, the temperature difference between my home and the inside of the jar was just too much to keep up. In the end, I decided that messing around with the ecosystem would do more harm than good in the long run. I decided to see where things would go, even with the excess moisture. Ultimately, I think it was a good decision. Me leaving the terrarium alone didn't make things go how I planned, full of life. But what it did do is pretty interesting. The condensation slowly disappeared, and some sort of fungi or mold began growing on the bark. Although it's not what I wanted, it's still a form of life. I'm excited to see how it grows as I spend more time alongside it.